Hi, my name is Sharon Yamato. I'm a filmmaker. I'm based in Los Angeles, California. Um, my prime area of specialty deals with the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. I am a descendant of a family that was in camp based in Poston, Arizona. So not necessarily Tule Lake, but I have a real strong connection to the area through the Tule Lake pilgrimage, actually, which I've attended many times. But I've been making films for roughly 15 years, all pretty much documentary shorts on the subject of the camps that have some relationship to the camps. So that is my sort of reason to make films.
Okay. And speaking of, with this newest film, One Fighting Irishman, uh, definitely being, in my opinion, a really interesting approach for covering this sort of historical topic, and also covering that pseudo auto or pseudo biographical of also covering the story of this lawyer, of trying to bring a spotlight to them. And then I guess my first question would be, what would you say would be your primary motivation behind wanting to make this project in particular?
I think it would start with the fact that the Tule Lake Segregation Center was right there. I've always had a real strong interest in that camp because of the fact that it was, again, a segregation center. It was out of the 10 permanent camps the Japanese were placed in, that happened to be considered the worst. It was different from all the rest. It had higher security. It was a more stringent and very, very, very I guess, more horrible place to be of all the camps. So that was the beginning of my interest in doing a film about Tule Lake. But when I've been attending the pilgrimages there since 1996, and in 2014, I was able to hear the son of the attorney who I'm profiling in this film. His name is Wayne Merrill Collins. His father was Wayne Mortimer Collins. Um, and that was the impetus for me focusing on this incredibly little known civil rights hero that actually the people who know him the best are the people who are at Tule Lake, and they absolutely think he walks on water, which he does. He did something no other attorney did or would have done during that horrible period of time. So that's one of the motivating factors beyond Tule Lake.
And I really enjoyed it, of seeing that perspective, of showing that, of bringing a spotlight to, among all of the different figures during that time in World War II, and immediately after, especially in the midst of the throes of numerous different causes and improvements to civil rights during that time period, but also shining a light on Wayne Collins, and also when historically in cinema we've already seen a ton of representations. Of course, like there's the Oscar Schindler, and all these other, like, very well known civil rights figures, or those that did so much for the for marginalized and oppressed groups during World War II, and just, or the Holocaust, or between all those different factors. And while of course people like, Schindler's List and then their own dramatizations, that there's such a significance in bringing that also home to America, and also showing the things that happened in America during that time, and providing that scrutiny and that critical lens to our own, like, actions during that time, and the actions of governments, but also the people that stepped up and really helped others that no one would initially expect them to help, but went above and beyond, and results of that.
Exactly. I think given the tenor of the times, which, it's hard for us to imagine today, but the fact that the Japanese Americans were so despised and hated during that period really says a lot about really one of the very few attorneys who stepped up to defend them. And he didn't just defend Japanese Americans in the Tulile camp. He defended one of the key person who his name is Fred Korematsu. I don't know if your audience would be familiar with him, but he was very important to the cause because he resisted the curfew for the
Yeah.
incarcerations. And then he stepped up when he found out about what was going on at Tule Lake to represent more than 5,500 people. And literally, his defense of them took 23 years. I mean, he started during the war. He did not finish until 1968, so many years afterwards. And he was able to help most all of them. I'd say there were maybe 30 or 40 that he couldn't reach, but he was able to. The most important thing that I think he did was he regained citizenship for all of them, or at least helped a great deal. I mean, there were others who were working on it, but he was definitely the person who filed the lawsuits that regained American citizenship for people who were citizens to begin with, but renounced during this horrible period in our history. So he was a really phenomenal attorney. I mean, again, you say that these others that did things for people in need. I think he is definitely a standout in that regard, and the fact that not very many people know about him makes it
No.
all more.
Yeah, and that definitely like an unsung hero, at least now being sung about, or
That's
at least
correct.
having like bringing more of that spotlight. And like you said, that he didn't just like do what he would feel would be the bare minimum. He got in the trenches and he fought passionately
Correct.
for this group of people that, of course, it also was shown and shown in the film of that he's quite different. Of course, the fighting Irishman, but I think that truly on that broad thematic level speaks to the true spirit of America. That
Mhm.
you can go and fight for and defend other Americans regardless of where they're from, regardless of their origin, that if they are American, they deserve the same treatment and respect that you or anyone else in the country does.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I maybe this is a good time to tell the story of George Takei, who
Yeah,
I hope your audience knows is the actor activist. He's very big on social media.
I
Uh,
do. And I assumed like 'cause as I kind of went into first watching the film blind because I didn't want to like preemptively build any expectations. And then once I saw that he was narrating and he was so also deeply involved in the project, I got really excited. I'm also very curious on like your thoughts and anything you wanted to share about him and his work with the film.
oh, there's so much to say about him because first of all, let me just say that when I came up with the idea to have him narrate the film, I had actually worked with him once before, but I emailed him and within, I don't know, hours, moments, it seemed, he responded absolutely because Wayne Collins was that important to him. And as I've said and told others, he wrote a piece in, I think it was on a website about the war that there were three the most influential men in his life were his father, Gene Roddenberry, who produced Star Trek, and Wayne Collins. And the reason being that he attributes his American citizenship to Wayne Collins. Had Wayne Collins not represented his mother, who had renounced her citizenship, was ready to be put on a boat to be sent back to Japan with her family. Wayne Collins stepped in and was able to, sort of put a halt to that deportation. Had that not happened, George would probably not be an American
No.
citizen. today.
history it would be so different,
Yes,
not
yeah,
just of just American history, but of entertainment history too, and of with science fiction, with Star Trek, and that just how watching that through line and all the directions that it could take, and sort of George being at the forefront of this project really kind of lasers in and focuses on that point of that, like, without Wayne, all of these stories would have remained untold and their hardships would have remained unchanged, if not gotten worse. And
absolutely.
without him going in there and doing the hard work that needed to be done, regardless of whatever spotlight may or may not have been shown on him at the time, it shows just how big of an impact that he had on everyone. And the obviously with George, one of the more prominent results of it.
Yes, yes. I would say that he's probably one of the more, yeah, prominent would be the word, people that he was able to rescue, I guess is the word. He was able to save them from being deported, and
Yeah.
it was not an easy task.
No.
And so that was the reason I think that George really had, a deep personal commitment to helping with this project. The other thing that was interesting about him, about Takei, was that during the making of the film, as I was doing the research, I discovered his mother's paperwork that Wayne Collins she had submitted to Wayne Collins to try to get her citizenship back, and in it were some really horrible things about the way they were treated at Tule
Yeah.
Lake. And that was something that George was not familiar with because he had never seen this affidavit that she had filled out. So it was sort of in the midst of our filming that I sent it to him, and thinking that
Wow.
he'd probably seen it at one point. The next day, he called and said, he was incredibly
Wow.
emotional about it. He said, I've never seen this. I didn't know this. I didn't know my father was beaten
Wow.
by members of the Hoshidan, and my parents never spoke about it. Not that his father never spoke about camp, because he was one of the few who did, but he was not familiar with that particular incident. And it really threw him for a loop, because we recorded. It was interesting because we recorded the segment with him talking about his mother later that week, and he was still incredibly emotional. And the emotion that he shows in that scene is, I think, what was definitely not made up. He
No.
really very upset about it,
Yeah.
because that was someone he was incredibly close to his parents. So I think that, and the fact that this came to him by surprise, I think, was also
Yeah.
another.
And I can to me, I can only imagine the feeling that that you could get from that, and that you'd be able to, in the process of making this film, were able to give something more to one of the victims, people that were directly affected by it, and that his parents, and having that connection and through line just established and shown that by being a part of this project, he was able to experience or come across something that he had never seen before, hadn't seen to that point. I can only imagine just the weight of it.
Well, I think more important to say is that there are probably thousands of others who can have experienced who might have experienced similar situations had they read their parents' affidavits or grandparents' affidavits. These were papers that were filed by Wayne Collins to the court to try to get their citizenship back, and they were very graphic in the fact that they were under an incredible amount of duress while being held at Tule Lake, which can be, which Wayne Collins was smart enough to say, this was duress that was created by the fact that they were there in the first place. Had they not been there, there would not have been the very often violent situations that they were placed in. So I know that there are lots of stories. The good thing is that the descendants, hopefully, are sort of getting back into touch with the stories of their parents and grandparents. We showed recently at the Tule Lake Pilgrimage, and I was overwhelmed by the response. That's all I have to say. I mean, it was amazing how many people were really, really moved by this. And these were people who were directly or indirectly affected. I mean, their parents were at Tule Lake, so they had that through line of, yeah, this happened to us, and the response was really overwhelming. I mean, there was we I really don't like to brag, but we had a standing ovation that
No,
was
yeah. The brag away. This is the
no,
place to do it.
it was heartwarming. Well, heartwarming, but it was interesting because at one point I thought to myself, now do I stop them? You know, I've never been in a situation like that. So because I was about to introduce the speakers, and at any rate, it was really, really gratifying to know that people were really being touched by this, and that their own stories were part of this film.
Yeah, yeah. It's just the feeling that just as a filmmaker or just from that the goals of filmmaking is in including that if you can build that emotional impact and authenticity in your audience and not only being able to do that with an audience but the people you are directly working with that have those connection points, the ability to create a project or um, do that sort of work to capture how it's significant to them and make
Mm.
them also better appreciate and understand that that is to me there's like no better feeling and no better experience.
You couldn't have said it better than than I would have said it. Honestly, it was really, really well, actually, it's funny because I've been taking this film on the road. I'm always amazed at the response because I have gotten equally enthusiastic, well, maybe not quite equally, I shouldn't say that. I've gotten enthusiastic response from people who know a little bit of the story but don't know all, certainly. I mean, my goal was to tell it in more depth than it's ever been told, but the people who don't know the story are really very moved by it. And that's also very, very gratifying. I mean, I really want to reach those people too, because I want them to know that this happened, that this happened. And sadly, it could happen again.
Yeah, and
So
it's lest we forget
exactly,
that
exactly.
we
And
each other.
yeah, that's the whole point, I think, of doing the work that I do, because I think there are a lot of people who'd rather think it didn't happen.
Yeah,
They'd rather not deal with what went on, and it wasn't pretty, and it wasn't, just this. I mean, there's a lot of things that happened among the Japanese that wasn't Japanese Americans that wasn't pretty. So I want to show it in its honesty. I don't want to cover it up. I don't want to make us seem like the heroes and the government seem like the tyrants. I think it's important for us to just present the picture. So that's what I'm really thrilled to be able to do in these film
yeah.
festivals like yours.
That leads into another like one of the biggest questions that I wanted to ask, or at least a comment that I wanted to bring up is I so greatly appreciated and noticed and acknowledged of how well you identified and approached the nuance of the situation and
Thank
of the differences of opinions and perspectives, not only even among elements of the American government and people that created and put the Japanese in the camps, but also among the sub communities of the Japanese Americans themselves,
Mhm, mhm.
and the back and forth and the struggles and the adversity that occurred from that, and I think just from a documentary standpoint of being a documentarian of that is the platonic ideal and perfect approach of providing as much information to not just create one spun story or one singular perspective, but to show as much of the context as possible and give people a much broader, in depth appreciation. And I think this film definitely succeeded with that.
Oh gosh, thanks. That's a huge compliment. Because it definitely was my goal to be objective, not to show one side or another, but at the same time, obviously this was it's a terrible time, and it was a terrible time for Japanese Americans, like you pointed out, among our own population. There was an incredible amount of conflict, and it sadly, there's some of that exists to this day. I mean, there is still a very black mark over people who were at Tule Lake. And that's why people there who are descendants, their parents never spoke about it because it was considered such a shameful thing to be placed in a camp where they were considered the bad ones, the disloyal ones. That was the moniker that they got. So it it is a camp unlike all the others. But in turn, because it was considered this bad camp, there was so much internal strife.
Yeah.
Um, and some of it created by the government, others, because there were some pro-Japanese nationals who were also imprisoned there. So there was an incredible amount of internal fighting that I definitely wanted to point out because I don't think it's healthy for us to hide it. Um, but I will always end with the fact that, as Wayne Collins said, this wouldn't have happened had they not put all the so-called disloyals and some loyal people into camp, into this, you know, we call it a pressure cooker. I mean, it's like being in this confined center where there were all kinds of walls and fences and prisons within the camp.
And
So,
it's one of those things. Sorry, not to cut you off, but just I think the film really excellently portrays that idea of when you put all these people in that pressure cooker environment, it's inevitable for something to boil over. And
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's like probably violence that happens in prisons. Um, when you're mistreated over and over again in every conceivable way, I think it bleeds out. And there was the mistake, the biggest mistake, and I don't think it was really purposeful. I think the government made this mistake, is they decided who was disloyal based on this questionnaire. They asked these people, will you profess loyalty to the US or Japan? And of course, some of them couldn't understand the question, whatever. Anyway, they put all these people who they thought were disloyal into a camp with a whole bunch of people who were the complete opposite. They were really like, no, 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 we're loyal, we're loyal. And the consequences of that were, and they didn't separate them in the camp.
no,
They tossed them all in the same area. And so there was a lot of like this kind of backstabbing that went on, and a very unfortunate, you know, result of this government edict to put all these people in a camp, right? And so anyway, that was, I think Wayne Collins's brilliance stems from the fact that and the reason he was able to get citizenship back for more than 5,000 people is because he said that. He said, hey, it's the government's fault for doing this in the first
he
place.
was he was one of the few that was able to actually that had the knowledge and awareness and even the willingness to address this elephant in the room that may or may not have been obvious to other people, what was obvious to him of
So,
the not just the injustice of the situation itself, but of what additional the nuances of the injustices that were being
Correct.
committed
Yeah,
because of
yeah,
the insensitivity of the situation outright.
very absolutely. I'm so glad you got that. That's really I'm I'm heartwarmed that you were able to get that. But yeah, he and I try to make the point too in the film. He was a little on the crazy side.
Yes.
He wasn't quite normal, and I think that helped in the situation because you had, as someone pointed out, you had to be crazy to take this on. It was a monumental task to free that many people. And
You have to be a little different to be willing to stand up and speak out in those moments.
absolutely. I mean, I mean, people always say to me when I talk about when I first started doing this work, they were saying, "Oh, well, the Japanese Americans were put in camps." I said, "But it was, part of the tenor of the times, and you have to understand the mass hysteria and blah blah blah." And I thought, yeah, absolutely, but we cannot imagine. I think it's very hard for us to put ourselves back in that period when Japanese Americans were so hated. I mean, I think it's way worse than, well, I don't know. Today it's probably Muslims, immigrants, there's a lot of groups that are hated. But at the time, I think Japanese Americans were so completely detested by the
Yeah.
population at
And
large.
I think a message of the film, especially so in that same breadth is, of course, anyone can say about events in history of what happened previously, oh, it was just an aspect of the times, is that like, sure, there's that, but it would also be so reductive to think that there weren't people around back then still screaming their heads off at the injustice, and that they were not going to sit by and let that happen. And I
Well,
think Wayne is a perfect it's a perfect icon of that.
yeah, it's funny because we're greedy. We wish we had more people like Wayne Collins, because at the time he was really one of very few. Even when you think about the National ACLU, today's standard bearer for civil justice did not back him. So there were very few people, organizations that he could turn to for assistance. And
Institutional failures on multiple levels.
yeah, I mean, and groups that we think were fairly liberal. Luckily, the Northern California ACLU, which was just one of the local ACLUs, was able I mean, they worked together very, very strongly. In fact, Ernest Bessig, who is one I tried to show in the film as well, deserves a film of his own. I mean, he was right there working alongside Wayne Collins and doing things for Japanese. I mean, these are people who were not, there are very few people outside of camp who could do anything, and very few lawyers.
Yeah.
So I really, again, I I I wish that there were more, but the fact that these guys were standing up really makes his role all the more important,
Yeah.
because it doesn't take, one man can do it. I mean, I hope that's a message that comes through too. That if individuals can fight and make a difference, um, I mean, I try to think of that,
All it
in
takes is one person in the right place, in the right time, who
yeah.
sees what's in front of them and says, "No, I'm not gonna let this happen."
I hope we all take that to heart. I
Yeah.
do.
And
Yeah.
I will say, I there are so many more questions I want to ask, but I also think this is a beautiful place to end it from here. I guess my for our last thought, Sharon, thank you so much for doing this. If there's anything else that you'd want people who have seen your film to take away from it, what would it be?
There's anything else. Gosh, you've covered so many great points, and you got it so well. Here's something that and this may not answer your question, but I am really grateful to be showing it at the Klamath Falls Film Festival. And the reason being, like I said, we showed it to descendants of Tule Lake who were overwhelmed by it. But I am really want to get in touch with the local population because I want to, I've been to Klamath Falls many times, like I said, 5 or 6 times, but I feel like there might be a disconnect between the people who are at Tule Lake and the local population. And I really hate that. I would really like to see us become more conversant on the whole issue of what happened there. And I'm hoping that's something that we can all work to change. So I'm really, really thrilled to be showing because at least, if nothing else, if we can open up the conversation, I'm grateful for that because I think that we all need to talk a little more amongst ourselves about ethnic and racial differences, about civil injustice, about all these things that happened, in 1942 that we haven't really quite come to terms with. So thank you, Klamath Falls. I hope, to open up some dialogue with people there. I look
Absolutely.
forward
And
to
I think this is a huge step in the right direction. Okay. Thank you so
that.
much, Sharon. I'm going to stop the recording here. And thank you so much.